Proposition 13, passed in 1978, transformed the relationship between state and local government and fundamentally changed the way that California property owners are taxed and how local government services are funded. Not surprisingly, Proposition 13 continues to be controversial almost 40 years on. How has Prop 13 impacted property owners and local governments? Has it helped or hurt local business owners, developers, and home ownership? We'll ask our guests, Brian Uhler and Carolyn Chu from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office, who recently authored a report on Prop 13. California's Prop 13, Holy Grail or Epic Fail?
Additional funding for the Maddy report made possible by a grant from The Wonderful Company, harvesting health and happiness around the world. From the California channel at the state capitol and the Maddy Institute, it's the Maddy report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. Perhaps no proposition has received more notoriety as an expression of direct democracy and ballot box budgeting for good and bad than Proposition 13 passed in 1978. A recent report by the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office examined Proposition 13 and how it's affected the way people live and how state and local government actually do business. Our guests are the authors of that report. Brian Uhler, welcome Brian.
Thank you for having us.
And Carolyn Chu, welcome.
Thank you.
So Brian, I'll start with you. Let's put property taxes in perspective. How much money do property taxes generate every year, and what percentage of the state budget are property taxes?
About statewide, property taxes raise about $55 billion per year. And to put that in perspective, all local governments' total revenues are about $200 billion, and the state's general fund revenues are about $120 billion.
So it's not the most important state tax, right? Personal income tax.
It's right. It's the second largest government revenue source in the state.
Second's important. That's still pretty good. So I want to ask you, property taxes were a very contentious issue leading up to the passage of Proposition 13 in 1978. How were they calculated? How were property taxes calculated before Proposition 13, and why was it such a volatile issue?
Every property owner's property tax bill is the product of basically two numbers. One is their tax rate, and the other is the assessed value of their property. And prior to Prop 13, each property owner's tax rate was essentially the sum of the tax rate levied by each individual local government serving their property. So
So there could be variances.
Yeah, that's right. So each property might be served by a city and a county and maybe a fire district or in a school district or some other special districts. And each property owner paid a rate that was the sum of each of those levies, and there was variation across each property owner. And then the value of each property was determined based on its market value, or basically what the property owner could sell for at that time. And the product of those two things was the property owner's tax bill.
And the market value was determined by who? Was that the local official?
That's right, by the county assessors. They determined the market
Okay,
value.
and so, yeah, it depends on the assessor you have, I suppose, what they value the property. Okay, so Carolyn, you get Proposition 13. It makes a lot of changes. What were the basic provisions of Proposition 13?
For the basic provisions of Proposition 13 as they relate to the property tax, the first was that it changed or it limited the overall property tax rate to 1%. So as Brian explained, each local government could levy its own rate, set its own rate sort of based on its needs for its services. Prior to 13. And then 13 said the sum of those rates cannot exceed 1%. So not only did it reduce overall rates, before Proposition 13 rates were about 2.6%, and Proposition 13 lowered them down to 1%.
So that's a big cut. I mean, it's almost a 2/3 cut.
Correct. So the other element of Proposition 13 was that it changed the basis for calculating the property tax rate. So before, as Brian explained, property taxes were based on the market value of property, and Proposition 13 said property values will be based on the acquisition value, so what you bought your home for.
What you actually sell it for.
What you bought your home for.
Oh, I'm sorry, bought it for. Right.
What you bought it for, and then it allowed for a 2% increase or inflation, whichever was lower, annually. So after that. So no longer would your property taxes be based on the market value, they'd be based on this adjusted acquisition value.
So I think almost immediately then there's going to be a drop in property tax revenue. I think I read in your report 60% drop?
That's right. The property tax revenues for local governments at the time Proposition 13 passed dropped about 60%. In addition, that meant that the property tax payments by property owners also dropped by about 60%. So local government's revenues went down, but people's property tax bills also went down.
And there was another thing. You were very specific about saying this is what it did to property taxes, but Proposition 13 also did something else, and that was the 2/3 vote requirement. Can you briefly explain that?
Sure. So Proposition 13 required 2/3 voter approval for special taxes. So it imposed this new voter approval for special taxes levied by local
And
governments.
special taxes are taxes, what, levied for a specific purpose?
Correct.
Okay, so what were the implications then for taxpayers and local governments? So we see a 60% drop in taxes
Correct.
for individuals. What else?
So property taxes declined by about 60% for local governments and for taxpayers. Proposition 13 also said the state shall allocate the revenues from the property tax.
I think I'm hearing something here, and that is he who has the gold makes the rules.
Yes.
So it shifted, I'm assuming it shifted power then to the state.
Well, so the proposition directed the state to allocate the revenues, and what the state did was it essentially said your share of the 1% rate will be the same as it was before 13. So if in your county you, relative to all your other local governments, got about 30% of the property tax revenue, after 13 you would still get about 30% of the property tax revenue, but it would be of this new lower rate overall. And essentially, that was locked in since Proposition 13 passed. What local governments got then, they continued to get into the future.
Okay, so that kind of, I assume then it's kind of shifted, I think we're going to have a conversation on how it shifted away from property taxes to other kind of levies by local governments, I assume.
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll talk about that in a moment. Thank you for the basics of Prop 13. So how have property owners fared under Prop 13? That was the focus, that was the point. We'll have that conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Proposition 13 was squarely aimed at property taxes. What impact has it had on property owners? Our guests are Brian Uhler and Carolyn Chu with the nonpartisan State Legislative Analyst Office. They recently authored a report assessing Prop 13 40 years after its passage. So Brian, you know, one of the things you hear sometimes is that under Prop 13, similar property owners are taxed differently. Is that true?
Yeah, that is true, and I think it's a product of the fact that Prop 13 is an acquisition value system, that what your tax bill is based on, essentially what you paid for your property adjusted for inflation over time, and what happens with that is essentially the amount of tax relief that is provided to you by Prop 13 as compared to what you would be paying under a market value system like we had before Prop 13, it grows the longer you own your property. And
so if you bought a house in San Francisco for $100,000, you know, umpteen years ago, you're paying, the property value is $100,000 until it's sold.
Right, or $100,000 adjusted by about 2%
okay, 2%,
a year.
okay, right, 2%.
But still,
inflation generally runs more than 2% a year, so you're doing well if you're holding on to it.
That's right. In most cases, in the vast majority of cases, for people who have owned their property for several years, they're taxed at a value that's far below what they could sell for today. And because of that, you wind up with differences in property taxes paid by owners of similar properties, simply based on how long they've owned the property. And
so you could have, you know, same income, same age, same basic wealth, but you could pay vastly different property taxes.
That's right. Yeah, and yeah, that is one thing that we found, that some people might assume that the differences are just a function of people's age, that older homeowners are more likely to own their homes for longer, and therefore they're the ones who are receiving the benefit. But in fact, we looked at a similar age cohort in the Bay Area who own, you know, about a median-priced home, and found that the property taxes varied from under $1,500 to over $7,500. So
that's quite the range.
Yeah.
Well, you know, one thing about Prop 13, the tax relief, I'm wondering if it varies from income, and if so, who benefits? Do higher income people benefit? Do lower income people benefit more from Prop 13?
Well, what we saw when we looked at the data was essentially these tax benefits are pretty much proportional to the amount of home wealth you have. And perhaps unsurprisingly, higher income Californians have more home wealth. They're more likely to own a home, and the homes that they do own are
homes
more.
Plural. They could own more than one home.
That's true, yeah. And so because of that, and the fact that we found that essentially these tax benefits are roughly proportional to the amount of home wealth you own, that the total dollar amount of tax benefit was highest for high-income Californians. About 50% of the total dollar of tax benefit was going to Californians with incomes of $120,000.
Yeah, I see the bulk of the relief in your report says goes to people with incomes in excess of $120,000. And so I think you even made an example of a person who makes less than $50,000, I think it was. They have a typical home that's much less expensive than someone making, you know, $500,000, and so therefore they don't benefit as much on Prop 13 as the wealthy person. You know, but it does seem that, you know, a lot of people that rent, and wealthy people do own rental property. So if they're getting a break on their rental property taxes, maybe that passes on to the renters. Did you find that?
I mean, there's certainly that argument has been made that is a potential benefit of Prop 13. It's something that's pretty hard to measure, and it wasn't something that we were able to quantify in our report. You know, we do see that there is this potential argument that a landlord who's facing a lower property tax bill might pass on some of that benefit to the renter, but to the extent to which that happens in practice, we weren't able.
We weren't really able to define completely. Okay, so what about this though? It seems that from what you're telling me that there's a certain incentive to hold on to property longer. Is that true?
Yeah, so like I said, your tax benefit from Prop 13 essentially is a function of how long you've owned your home. So the longer you've owned it, the greater benefit you have. And if you were to move, that tax benefit essentially resets to zero. You start paying taxes again on the market value of your home, which will be what you paid for it in that year. And so that does ostensibly create a disincentive for people to move. And we did find that in the data. For example, if you look at the turnover in properties immediately prior to Prop 13, about 16% of properties statewide were sold, and in the most recent year of data, we saw that only about 5% of properties turned over, so a significant decline in the number of properties that are turning over.
There's also something about people over 55, that there's a big change from 54 to 55. What was that about?
That's right. So California, subsequent amendments to Prop 13 have allowed homeowners over 55 to essentially transfer their tax benefit to a new home. To try to allow them to, sort of allow an empty nester to downsize to a smaller retirement home, say. And we found that there's a significant jump in the number of homeowners that are moving, the likelihood that a homeowner will move when you go from 54 to 55, sort of suggesting that you had a lot of homeowners that were holding out because they didn't want to lose their tax benefit.
They want the tax benefit. Yeah. Well, Carolyn, let me ask you, you found that after Proposition 13, residential properties paid more than commercial and industrial properties, a larger share of property taxes. How big is that difference, and is Prop 13 exclusively to blame here?
Well, so what we looked at was the share of property taxes paid by homeowners specifically. So homeowners living in owner-occupied homes, not residential properties overall. Unfortunately, we can't quite measure that. But in terms of homeowners, what we saw was that the share of property taxes paid by homeowners did increase slightly from about 32% in the early 80s to about 37% today. What we saw, though, was that the number of residential properties has increased far more than the number of commercial and industrial
Well, the only thing about that
properties.
number, about that 37%, is really not that far off Prop 13. It was about 34%, you said, at the beginning of the report?
That's right.
So
that's
pretty
right.
close.
Yeah, it is. So it's some growth. So, but what we saw is that there's also been a much larger growth in the number of residential properties as compared to commercial industrial properties. So the number of residential properties has increased about 60%.
So it's not surprising that they're paying a little bit larger share.
Right.
Of
Well, compared to commercial industrial properties. Some have thought that commercial industrial properties are paying a smaller share of property taxes today than before 13 because in theory, commercial and industrial properties can own properties for longer. So the benefits they receive from this acquisition value calculation would be greater because in theory they would own the properties for longer than residential properties. What we saw in the data, however, was that the relative turnover rates between commercial and for commercial and industrial properties compared to residential properties really wasn't that different, that they were turning over at relatively similar rates.
We're going to talk about that in a moment, how Proposition 13 has either helped or hurt new housing and business creation. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Proposition 13 has appeared to lower property taxes, but has that encouraged or discouraged housing development and business creation? Our guests are authors of a recent report on Proposition 13, Brian Uhler and Carolyn Chu from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst Office. So Brian, let me ask you this. It seems like new businesses, they're going to have to purchase property. And so they seem to be at a competitive disadvantage to others who have been in the business for a while. They don't have to buy new property. So they are paying higher, new businesses are paying higher property taxes, bottom line. So has that discouraged new business creation?
So we were able to look at some data on comparing areas that had a high concentration of tenured businesses, lots of existing businesses that were receiving a high amount of tax benefit from Prop 13, and comparing that to areas that had more concentration of newer businesses to see that it looked like new business creation was being discouraged from the places where there were lots of existing businesses. And we didn't see any difference in business formation across those areas, sort of suggesting that this differential treatment in taxes wasn't
the property tax issue is not a big deal, apparently, for these startups. Well, let me ask you this. Has Prop 13 altered the way property owners develop their properties, making their property decisions?
All right, we did see some evidence that vacant land, we looked at vacant land in some big cities and asked the question, essentially, property that's been owned longer, was it less likely to be developed? And we saw a significant drop off in the likelihood of property being developed the longer it was owned, and essentially the higher the property, the Prop 13 tax benefit was.
Yeah, and I think the numbers you came up with were if you own property 5 to 10 years, you were 4 times more likely to be developed than if you own property for 20 to 25 years. So that's a pretty substantial difference. Well, Carolyn, let me ask you this. The effect of Prop 13 on the housing industry, has it increased impact fees for developers?
So we looked at the median impact fee over time since about the early 90s, and we did see that the median impact fee for a residential building permit, so to build a house essentially, has increased about 150%. So we have seen a notable increase since the early 90s in impact fees. We also looked at the relative difference in impact fees in cities where a parcel tax, which is like a flat fee property tax.
It seems like they got all these different ways to get you, an impact fee, a parcel tax.
So we looked at cities that were able to pass a parcel tax as compared to cities that either failed to pass a parcel tax or did not put a parcel tax to the voters. And what we saw there was that the impact fees were much higher in the median impact fees were much higher in cities that had not passed a parcel tax as compared to the ones that passed
Nature
a parcel tax.
pours a vacuum, so if you can't get money from the parcel tax, you go get it from the impact fee.
Right, so what we're seeing is a shift from property taxes to these other types of fees, potentially.
Well, let me ask you this. There's another thing called an assessment, another way to tax you. Did that increase after Prop 13?
What we looked at were specifically Mello-Roos taxes, so taxes for typically infrastructure development associated with new housing communities. And we did see an increase in about 130% on average in terms of those types of special taxes to pay for what had historically been paid for by the property tax.
I want to ask, though, for clarification. So you've got a parcel tax, you've got an impact fee, and you've got an assessment, 3 different things. Which one of those needs voter approval? It would seem that if you need voter approval, that would be the hardest to get, and those that don't would be the easiest to get.
Parcel taxes require voter approval, as do Mello-Roos taxes.
Assessment.
In that case, though, for Mello-Roos, if a land developer, if like a community developer owns all the parcels, that can be the only voter.
Right, so
for
they
that
say
particular
yes,
tax.
and they simply pass on the tax to the purchaser.
Right, and the Mello-Roos tax is carried on by the ultimate property owner.
Okay, but the other one, the impact fee, that can be just simply assessed.
Right. Impact fees can be developed by the city and placed upon developers without any voter approval.
So Brian, has Prop 13 increased or decreased home ownership?
That's a little bit of a complicated question, and the answer is sort of yes, that it's both increased and decreased depending on sort of the cohort of people you're looking at. So we did find some evidence that among, say, older homeowners or fixed income retirees, that there was some evidence that it might be promoting homeownership among that group. But
that was a problem pre-Prop 13, that some of these older people on fixed incomes couldn't pay the increased property taxes.
That's right. And on the flip side, we see that some of these increase in fees and Mello-Roos taxes that we were just talking about, that a lot of that burden is being borne by newer, younger homeowners.
I mean, they're having a harder time.
And we're seeing falling homeownership rates among that group. So the answer is sort of yes, it's probably both increased and decreased depending on.
And it depends on where you are in that equation, whether you like it or not, I suppose. Well, up next, we're going to talk about the bottom line impact of Prop 13 on local government. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. Proposition 13 created a seismic shift on how local governments do business. The question is, has it made local government better or worse? We're talking to 2 experts on Proposition 13, Carolyn Chu and Brian Uhler from the nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's office, about the impact of Proposition 13 40 years on. Carolyn, let me ask you, there's a general sense that local governments have seen a significant drop in revenue as a result of Prop 13. Is that really the case?
Well, when Proposition 13 passed, local government's property tax revenues dropped precipitously, 60% at the time. Since then, property taxes have increased a bit over 100%, adjusted for inflation. In addition, other types of taxes, sales taxes, hotel taxes, utility taxes, have increased over 600%. Overall, though, local governments, particularly cities and counties, their tax revenue has actually declined in real dollars since the time 13 passed.
So you were talking about overall, though, the revenue for local communities, is it kind of reached the point where it was I guess, adjusting for inflation prior to 13?
So for their tax revenue, local governments, cities and counties in particular, have, for the most part, caught back up with their property tax losses of 13 through their sales, hotel, and utility taxes. So at the time, they lost about $10 billion in revenue in real dollars, so today's dollars, and now they raise about $8.5 billion in those alternative types of taxes.
So it sounds like traditionally property taxes were where it's at for revenue for local governments, but that's now changed because of Prop 13.
That's right.
And it's changed kind of the mix of tax revenue. So we're talking about the hotel tax and the sales tax and all those kinds of things. So talk a little more about that.
Sure. So at the time Proposition 13 passed, property taxes made up almost 100% of cities and counties' revenues. Today, property taxes are just over 60% of their tax revenues, and the things that fill that gap are the sales tax, the hotel tax, utility taxes.
Hotel tax is really great because other people pay it as they're coming through town, right? So
They
I
do.
assume they're pretty popular.
They do. They are not typically borne by the residents.
Right. So you said, I'm sorry, I interrupted you. Sales tax, hotel, and utility taxes.
And utility taxes,
Okay.
yes.
And the cities and counties can kind of control that to some
They
extent.
can raise those locally, yes.
Okay, so Brian, it's kind of interesting. You hear a lot about the fiscalization of land use. The idea that, in fact, I've even been told by a local politician that, they'll put a car dealership in a neighborhood because it generates tax revenue. Because there's an incentive there because they're getting a sales tax on the sale of cars as opposed to a house, which they're not making really any money on. In fact, I think housing actually probably ends up costing a community probably, as opposed to the sales taxes. So is that true that now communities are thinking we got to get more of these kinds of retail businesses, hotels, car dealerships that are going to generate some revenue for us?
Well, there's certainly a lot of, as you said, there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that's been presented to sort of argue for this fiscalization of land use effect. And what we tried to look at to see if there really was a systematic effect of Prop 13 on land use decisions. And, we essentially compared the types of land use decisions that cities were making based on whether or not they were more or less dependent on sales tax and whether they received a higher or lower share of property tax. And the theory being that, for example, a city that was receiving a higher share of the local property tax, they would get more benefit from approving a new housing unit, and so they might be more inclined to approve housing. We didn't see that in the data.
These are the still pre-1978 rates adjusted for the 2%.
That's right. Yeah, and so you would think that the ones with the higher share be more inclined to approve housing. We didn't see that was true. We also might think that the cities that were more dependent on sales tax would be more inclined to approve retail developments, and we didn't see that in the data as well. So there wasn't a lot in the data that we looked at to suggest that there was a systematic effect.
When you saw the data, would you say this is counterintuitive? Did you?
I think we were honestly surprised. It does go against, again, a lot of sort of anecdotal reports, a lot of even what theory would suggest here. I think that probably taking our results with a little bit of caution, that we only looked at a recent decade of data, and certainly potentially someone else could look at the data come to different results, but we did what we thought was a reasonable.
When I saw that in your report, I said, that's really interesting because it's not what I would have expected. Quickly, the last question, Carolyn, when I ask you, I assume that there are some things that Proposition 13 has done. It's stabilized property rates, I assume, property taxes.
So what we looked at was whether or not property taxes were differentially stable before and after Proposition 13. And in terms of the revenue to local governments, what we found was that the revenue they received before and the revenue they received after were relatively similarly stable. The reason for this is that local governments could change their rates year to year before Proposition 13 to adjust for changes in market value.
So it hasn't made it any less stable.
That's correct.
Okay. Well, okay. Well, I want to thank our guests, Brian Uhler and Carolyn Chu, for being with us. If you want to stay up on local and state politics, you can follow the Maddy Institute on Facebook, Twitter, or log on to our website at maddyinstitute.com. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the California Channel or the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions expressed on the Maddy Report, visit our website at maddyinstitute.org.